May 1945. Europe is silent. The guns that had thundered for 6 years finally fall quiet. Cities smolder. Borders are redrawn. Survivors crawl out of the ruins, believing the worst is finally over. The greatest war in human history has ended. But inside one American general's mind, the war is only just beginning. While politicians speak of peace, while soldiers celebrate survival, General George S. Patton looks east and sees the next enemy. An enemy he believes must be destroyed immediately: the Soviet Union. Patton doesn't say it quietly. He doesn't whisper it behind closed doors. He says it openly, repeatedly, and with growing obsession. We defeated the wrong enemy. To him, Nazi Germany was only a preliminary battle. The real war, the inevitable war, would be against Stalin and the Red Army. And in Patton's vision of that future, one idea stands out as terrifying as it is unthinkable: using former German soldiers against the Soviet Union. The very men who had served Hitler, rearmed, redeployed, turned east. To Patton, this wasn't madness, it was strategy. And when word of these ideas begins to circulate, when intelligence whispers reach Moscow, Joseph Stalin becomes convinced of one thing: the next war is already being planned, and this single belief will reshape half of the planet. But to understand why one man could think this way, why he would even dare to suggest such a thing, we must first understand who George Patton truly was. Not the legend, not the speeches, but the mind. Patton was not like other generals. He believed he had lived before. He believed he had fought in ancient wars. He believed destiny followed him across centuries. To him, war was not just duty, it was purpose. He carried pistols with ivory grips into battle. He wrote poetry about death. He spoke of bloodshed as if it were sacred. And above all else, he believed one thing with absolute certainty: war revealed truth. Cowards were exposed. Heroes were forged. Civilizations were decided. To Patton, peace was not a victory, it was an interruption. Even during World War II, while fighting Nazi Germany, his hatred for communism burned hotter than his hatred for Hitler. He viewed the Soviet Union not as an ally, but as a temporary necessity, a dangerous one. He once warned, "We may have defeated the wrong enemy. The real threat is still standing." And as the Red Army pushed west through Eastern Europe, as Soviet flags rose over Berlin, as Stalin gained control over millions of lives, Patton's fears transformed into obsession. By the spring of 1945, the war in Europe was effectively decided. Hitler was dead. German resistance was collapsing. Allied leaders were already planning the post-war world. Patton, however, was planning something else entirely. He looked at the shattered remains of the German army and saw not defeated enemies, but unused weapons. He believed that if the Allies waited, the Soviets would solidify control over Eastern Europe. Their armies would entrench, their political influence would harden, and once that happened, removing them would become nearly impossible. To Patton, there was only one window left, and it was closing fast. His logic was brutally simple. The Germans hated the Soviets. They knew how the Soviets fought. They had spent 4 years bleeding against them, and they would gladly fight them again, if given the chance. In Patton's mind, yesterday's Nazis could become tomorrow's allies, not for ideology, but for survival. To many, this idea would sound monstrous. To Patton, it sounded efficient. And that is what made it truly dangerous. Because Patton was not just a loud general, he was a victorious one. A man whose aggressiveness had won battles. A man whose instincts had crushed enemy lines across France. When he spoke, people listened. And when he began talking about a future war with the Soviet Union, the echoes traveled farther than he realized. Washington was uneasy, London was alarmed, and Moscow was already listening. But none of them yet understood just how far Patton was willing to go. Because the next thing he proposed would shock even his own allies. And once that line was crossed, the world would never return to the fragile illusion of peace. In the ruins of defeated Germany, something impossible was quietly being discussed. Not reconstruction, not justice, not peace. A new war. And the most disturbing part wasn't who the enemy would be. It was who Patton wanted to fight it. By the summer of 1945, millions of German soldiers were prisoners. Entire divisions of the Wehrmacht had surrendered to the Western Allies rather than to the Soviets. They believed, often correctly, that captivity under the Americans and British meant survival. Under the Soviets, it often meant something else entirely. Patton knew this, and he saw opportunity in it. Behind closed doors, among staff officers and planners, his idea began to take form, not as a formal operation yet, but as a concept, a possibility, a contingency that, once spoken aloud, could never be unheard. The logic was cold. The German army had fought the Red Army longer and harder than anyone else on Earth. They understood Soviet tactics, Soviet psychology, Soviet weaknesses, and most importantly, they hated the Soviets with a bitterness forged in 4 years of annihilation. To Patton, that hatred could be repurposed. He proposed screening former German officers, selecting those with experience on the Eastern Front, re-equipping entire formations, placing them under Allied command, and if war broke out with the USSR, they would march east again, this time wearing different insignia. It was not just morally shocking, it was strategically radical, because this would mean, in essence, reversing the very outcome of World War II. The men who had served Hitler would now serve the Western democracies. The same soldiers who had once stormed into Soviet territory would be used to push the Red Army back. In Patton's mind, this was not betrayal, it was correction. But to the political leadership of the United States and Britain, the idea bordered on insanity. For 6 years, the world had been told that Nazism was absolute evil, that it had to be destroyed without compromise, that no peace with it was possible. Millions had died to prove that point. And now one of America's most famous generals was suggesting that those same forces be resurrected, not for defense, but for another invasion of the East. Even among hardened military planners, the proposal caused shock. Some officers saw it as dangerously premature, others as politically suicidal. A few, in silence, admitted that from a purely military standpoint, it wasn't entirely irrational, and that frightened them even more, because the battlefield math was unsettling. By 1945, the Soviet Union possessed the largest land army in human history, millions of veterans hardened by unimaginable losses. Entire regions were under Red Army control. Eastern Europe was rapidly slipping behind a new iron boundary. If a war were to happen in 1945 or 1946, the West would not be fighting a weakened Russia. It would be fighting a victorious one. Patton understood this, and he believed delay would be fatal. To him, waiting meant surrendering Europe one nation at a time. Poland, Romania, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, all falling into Stalin's sphere, not by war, but by pressure. He feared a slow conquest without firing a shot, so he argued for action, now, before the Soviet grip hardened, before nuclear weapons reshaped warfare, before fear made politicians hesitate. But politics had already begun to overpower generals. President Truman, newly in office and far less reckless than Patton, was deeply unsettled by the general's rhetoric. British leadership, already exhausted and financially broken, recoiled at the idea of another continental war. Publicly, Patton was warned. Privately, he was watched. His statements became liabilities, his temper became a threat. And yet, the most dangerous part of the story is this: Patton was not alone. Across the Western military and intelligence communities, a quiet realization was spreading. The wartime alliance with the Soviet Union was dissolving. Trust was evaporating, and everyone knew it. Some simply refused to say it aloud. Patton did. And because he said it without restraint, without diplomacy, without fear of consequence, his ideas began to move faster than his superiors could contain. Rumors traveled through military channels, conversations were overheard, reports were drafted, proposals, even if unofficial, left paper trails. And paper trails have a way of crossing borders. Because while the Western Allies were trying to decide whether Patton was merely reckless, Moscow was already trying to determine whether he was a signal of something far worse. A preview of the next war. And somewhere inside the vast machine of Soviet intelligence, a report began taking shape. A report that would soon land on Stalin's desk. A report that would convince him that peace was only a temporary illusion. In the summer of 1945, while the world celebrated victory, the Soviet Union quietly returned to its oldest habit: listening. The Kremlin had never trusted the West, not in 1918, not in 1939, and certainly not in 1945. The alliance against Hitler had been a marriage of necessity, not belief. Stalin had not forgotten that Britain and the United States had waited years before opening the Second Front. He had not forgotten the millions who died while the Red Army fought alone in the East. And now, as American troops occupied half of Germany and British intelligence spread across Europe, he assumed the next betrayal was already being planned. So he ordered his intelligence services to do what they did best: watch everything, listen to everyone, trust no one. By 1945, Soviet intelligence had penetrated deep into the Western world. Agents operated inside diplomatic missions, military circles, scientific communities, and political institutions. Some were ideological believers, others were blackmailed, a few were simply paid. Together, they formed a global nervous system for the Kremlin, and somewhere inside that system, Patton's words began to appear. At first, only as whispers, fragments of conversations, comments overheard in officer mess halls, rumors drifting through Allied headquarters, a general talking about a new war, a general talking about using German troops again. To Western ears, it sounded like reckless talk. To Moscow, it sounded like a forecast. Soon the fragments became reports. Reports became analyses. Analyses became conclusions. And the conclusions were terrifying. Soviet analysts began to piece together a picture of Patton not as an isolated extremist, but as a symptom of a larger Western shift. The war had ended too abruptly. The Soviet Union was too powerful. Eastern Europe was slipping from Western control. From Moscow's perspective, everything pointed in one direction. The West would not tolerate a Soviet-dominated continent. And if that was true, then Patton was not a madman. He was the loudest voice of a silent intention. By late 1945, internal Soviet documents began using a new kind of language. No longer the language of alliance, but the language of preparation. The Red Army, though exhausted, was not demobilized as rapidly as expected. Units remained stationed across Eastern Europe. Supply lines were reinforced instead of dismantled. Military industry did not return to civilian production at full speed. Stalin was hedging. He did not yet believe war was inevitable, but he was no longer convinced peace was permanent. Then came the most alarming development of all. Soviet intelligence began reporting that Patton's ideas were not confined to his own imagination, that certain Western planners were at least discussing post-war confrontation scenarios, that Germany, though defeated, was already being examined as a potential future asset. To Stalin, this was a nightmare repeating itself. He had seen this pattern before. After World War I, Germany had been humiliated, then quietly rebuilt, then unleashed again. Now, in his mind, the same script was being rewritten. Only this time, the target would be the Soviet Union. He reportedly told his inner circle, "The war never truly ends. It only changes shape." From that moment on, Soviet policy began to change. Not openly, not officially, but fundamentally. Where Stalin had once spoken of cooperation, he now spoke of security. Where joint reconstruction had been discussed, spheres of influence became the priority. Where trust had been publicly displayed, suspicion hardened beneath the surface. And all of it traced back to a single fear: that the West was already thinking about how to fight the USSR before the graves of World War II had even cooled. Yet even Stalin did not know just how fragile the Western Front truly was, because while Moscow was preparing for betrayal, Washington itself was struggling to contain the man who had sparked these fears in the first place, a man whose reputation was now becoming too dangerous to protect, and whose future was suddenly very much in doubt. At the height of his power, George Patton was untouchable, a battlefield legend, the liberator of cities, the general whose name alone could break enemy morale. But the war that made him a hero was over, and the peace was beginning to expose everything the war had protected him from. By late 1945, Patton was no longer seen as a necessary weapon. He was becoming a political liability. His uncontrollable speeches, his public contempt for denazification, his relentless anti-Soviet rhetoric, all of it was now a problem. The world wanted stability. Patton wanted another war. He openly criticized Allied occupation policies in Germany. He mocked the effort to remove former Nazis from positions of influence, arguing that they were the only ones capable of rebuilding the country efficiently. To the public, this sounded like sympathy for the enemy. To Washington, it sounded like sabotage. Newspapers turned against him. Political pressure mounted. Allies began to distance themselves. Behind closed doors, discussions shifted from how to use Patton to how to restrain him. He was quietly removed from operational command and reassigned to a far less influential role, overseeing routine administrative duties in occupied Germany. No more sweeping offensives, no more armies under his direct command. For a man like Patton, it was humiliation. He raged in his diary about betrayal, about weak politicians, about a world that refused to see the coming danger. He believed history would prove him right, even if his own country would not. And yet, despite his fall from power, his ideas did not disappear with him. Inside Western intelligence and military planning circles, quiet discussions about future confrontation with the Soviet Union continued, not with Patton's recklessness, but with growing realism. The alliance was unraveling. Eastern Europe was hardening into a Soviet bloc, and everyone could see it. In March 1946, Winston Churchill would stand in Missouri and utter words that would define a generation. An iron curtain has descended across the continent. But by the time he said them publicly, Stalin had already built most of it. Behind the scenes, the Soviet leader accelerated the creation of buffer states. Communist governments were imposed through pressure, purges, and carefully managed elections. Military garrisons became permanent, borders hardened. Every move was driven by one fear, that the West was only pretending to accept the post-war balance, that it was merely waiting for the right moment to strike. And in the background of that paranoia stood the image of Patton, the general who had spoken too openly, the general who had imagined a German army reborn, the general who, in Stalin's mind, represented the West's true intentions. Then, in December 1945, something happened that seemed to close Patton's chapter forever. A simple car accident, a quiet road, a sudden crash. Patton was severely injured. 12 days later, he was dead. Officially, it was a tragic accident. Unofficially, questions began immediately. The timing, the silence, the consequences. The man who had spoken most openly about a future war with the Soviet Union was gone. And with his death, the most reckless version of the plan died with him. But not the fear, not the mistrust, and not the preparations that had already been set in motion. Because while Patton was fading from history, Stalin was building something far more enduring than any single general. A divided continent, armed to the teeth, waiting. With Patton gone, the loudest voice calling for immediate war fell silent. But in Moscow, the silence was not interpreted as relief. It was interpreted as deception. Stalin did not believe that danger vanished with one man. He believed ideas were far more dangerous than individuals, and the idea that the West might one day turn Germany against the Soviet Union again. That idea had already taken root. So he moved, quietly at first, decisively after. Across Eastern Europe, a vast transformation accelerated at an alarming speed. What had once been described as temporary security measures turned into permanent military architecture. Soviet troops did not go home. They entrenched. Railways were reoriented eastward. Armories were expanded instead of dismantled. Airfields built during the war were upgraded for long-term use. Entire cities became logistical hubs for a future conflict that officially did not exist. To the outside world, it looked like consolidation. To Stalin, it was fortification. In Poland, political opposition was crushed with methodical precision. Non-communist leaders disappeared into prisons or graves. Elections were held, and then rewritten. The state became loyal not to its people, but to Moscow. In Hungary, the same pattern unfolded. So did in Romania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, East Germany. Everywhere the method was identical. First, coalition governments. Then, control of the security services. Then, the removal of rivals. Finally, total dominance. This was not ideology alone. This was military logic. Stalin was creating depth, strategic depth. If the West ever attacked, the war would no longer begin at the Soviet border. It would begin hundreds of miles away, in the heart of Europe. Entire nations became buffers, and their populations became hostages of geography. At the same time, Soviet military doctrine began to shift. Defensive language was paired with offensive planning. The Red Army studied Western equipment, Western doctrines, Western troop movements. The enemy was no longer Germany. The enemy was now theoretical, and therefore everywhere. But perhaps the most decisive shift came with one terrifying realization. In August 1945, the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In a single moment, warfare itself changed forever. To most of the world, the bomb represented the end of all wars. To Stalin, it represented the beginning of the most dangerous one. He immediately ordered the acceleration of the Soviet nuclear program. No expense was spared. No risk was too great. Scientists were pressured. Intelligence was unleashed. Entire cities became secret laboratories. If the West now possessed a weapon that could erase cities, then the Soviet Union had to obtain it as well, at any cost. From that moment forward, fear became permanent. Fear shaped policy. Fear shaped borders. Fear shaped the future. And all of it was driven by one central assumption, that the next war would not begin with warnings, it would begin with annihilation. Stalin no longer trusted treaties. He trusted only distance, armor, and deterrence. The world had entered a new era. But most people didn't realize it yet. They still believed the war had ended. In reality, it had simply changed its form. By every historical logic, another world war should have already begun. Two superpowers, mutual hatred, armies facing each other across a shattered continent. Ideology turned into doctrine, fear turned into policy. And yet, no direct war came. No massive invasion. No open declarations. No global mobilization. Only silence. A heavy, trembling silence filled with weapons. The reason was simple. For the first time in history, war had become suicidal. The atomic bomb had changed everything. In 1945, the United States possessed a weapon that could erase entire cities in seconds. The Soviet Union did not yet have it, but Stalin knew it was only a matter of time. For the first time, total war meant total extinction. No victory, only ashes. American leadership understood this just as clearly. Truman and his advisors realized that a direct war with the USSR would not resemble World War II. There would be no steady fronts, no slow campaigns, no gradual collapse. There would be only escalation, and then annihilation. Even Patton's fiercest supporters could not deny the new reality. Tanks and infantry no longer decided the final outcome. One bomb could now do what entire armies once could not, and that terrified everyone. At the same time, both sides were exhausted beyond measure. Europe lay in ruins. Entire economies were shattered. Cities were empty shells. Transportation networks barely functioned. Food shortages were widespread. Soldiers wanted to go home. The world no longer had the strength for another apocalyptic conflict. Not yet. And perhaps most importantly, Neither side truly trusted the loyalty of a reborn Germany. Patton believed German forces could be controlled, repurposed, disciplined. Political leaders did not. They feared unleashing something they had just barely managed to destroy. The memory of fascism was still too raw, the moral cost too great, the political risk too explosive. So the idea remained exactly where it was most dangerous, in the realm of unspoken planning, never authorized, never executed, but never forgotten. Instead of open war, something else emerged, a war without declarations, without clear battlefields, without a visible front, a war of shadows. Spies replaced soldiers, influence replaced invasion, economics replaced artillery, fear replaced banners. The Cold War had begun, not with a single shot, but with a mutual decision not to fire one. Both sides raced to accumulate power without triggering catastrophe. They built alliances instead of offensives, bases instead of trenches, missiles instead of marching armies. Germany, once the engine of destruction, was split in two. One half anchored to the west, the other chained to the east. No longer a weapon for either side, but a battlefield frozen in advance. And in that frozen line ran the fault line of the entire future. A future that would last nearly half a century. A future born not from peace, but from terror. History usually teaches us that wars begin with gunfire. A shot, an explosion, a crossing of a border. But the most dangerous war of the 20th century did not begin that way. It began in thoughts, in fears, in calculations made in silence. It began when one general refused to accept peace, and when one dictator refused to believe in it. Patton looked at the end of World War II and saw not victory, but delay. To him, the Soviet Union was not an ally who had helped defeat Hitler. It was the next empire that had to fall. He believed war was inevitable and therefore better fought sooner than later. Stalin looked at the same ending and saw something else entirely. He saw vulnerability. He saw betrayal waiting in the shadows. He saw the same Western powers that had once delayed opening the Second Front now standing deep inside Europe, armed, organized, and increasingly suspicious. And when he heard that one of their most famous generals was already imagining a new war, he drew his final conclusion. Peace was temporary. War was permanent. Everything that followed, the division of Germany, the iron grip over Eastern Europe, the arms race, the nuclear standoff, proxy wars across the planet, all of it grew from that shared conviction that the other side was only waiting for the right moment to strike. Patton never lived to see the Cold War. Stalin did. But both men helped shape it. One through reckless imagination, the other through relentless paranoia. And in the space between those two forces, the world became frozen in fear for nearly 50 years. No German divisions marched east again. No American tanks rolled toward Moscow. But the war still happened. In Korea, in Vietnam, in Afghanistan, in Cuba, in space, in cyberspace, in the shadows. Millions still died, trillions were spent, and entire generations grew up believing that annihilation was only minutes away. All because peace in 1945 was not trusted, not by those who held the most power. Today, when we look back at Patton's proposal to rearm the defeated army of Hitler, it feels unthinkable, monstrous, impossible. Yet in the logic of that moment, in the fear, the exhaustion, the hatred, and the ambition, it almost made sense to the men who stood at the edge of a ruined world. And that is the most frightening lesson of all. That history is not driven by calm minds, it is driven by frightened ones. The Second World War ended with surrender, but the Third World War never needed to begin. It has simply been waiting, in plans, in doctrines, in fears, and in the human instinct to believe that the next war will finally be the last.